Section 24 of the Complete Works of Tacitus, edited by Thomas Gordon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Graham Redman. The Complete Works of Tacitus, to which are prefixed political discourses upon that author. Edited and translated by Thomas Gordon, with introductory essays by Thomas Gordon. Volume 1. The Annals, Book 2, Section 6, The Death of Germanicus. As soon as it was known at Rome that Artaxias was by Germanicus given to the Armenians for their king, the fathers decreed to him and Drusus the lesser triumph. Triumphal arches were likewise erected on each side the temple of Mars the Avenger, supporting the statues of these two Caesars. And for Tiberius, he was more joyful to have established peace by policy than if by battles and victories he had ended the war. He therefore also assailed by the ways of craft Rescuporis, a king of Thrace. That whole nation had been subject to Rhemetalces, but upon his death one moiety was by Augustus granted to Rescuporis his brother, and one to Cotys his son. In this partition the vales, cities, and territories bounding upon Greece fell to Cotys. To Rescuporis the wilds, the hills, and the parts exposed to a hostile neighbourhood. The two kings were likewise dissonant in their genius, the former mild and agreeable, the latter cruel, rapacious, and impatient of equality. Yet at first they lived in hollow friendship, but in a while Rescuporis began to break bounds, to seize for himself the portions of Cotys, and, where he met resistance, to exercise violence. Cautiously, it is true, and by degrees in the life of Augustus, to whose grant they owed both their kingdoms, and, if his authority had been despised, his vengeance was dreaded. But upon the change of emperors he poured in bands of robbers, demolished forts, and thus sought to provoke war. Tiberius was about no consideration of state so anxious as that things once settled should never after be molested. He instantly dispatched a centurion to the two kings to forbid their proceeding to a decision by arms, and Cotys forthwith dismissed the forces he had raised. Rescuporis feigned submission and desired an interview, for that by treaty, he said, they might adjust all their differences. And upon the time, the place, and even upon the conditions, they quickly agreed, while one through easiness, one through fraud, yielded and accepted every proposition. Rescuporis, for a sanction, as he pretended to the league, added a banquet, and the festivity and drinking was prolonged till midnight, when Cotys, warm with wine and feasting, and void of circumspection, was suddenly loaded with chains, deprecating in vain the brutal treachery, by the inviolable rights of kings, by the common gods of their family, by that very banquet of sacred pledge of concord and hospitality. Rescuporis, having now seized all Thrace, wrote to Tiberius that bloody snares were contrived for him, but he had anticipated the contriver, and, pretending a war against the Bastonians and Scythians, fortified himself with new forces, horse and foot. He had a soft answer, that if he had practised no guile he might securely trust to his innocence. But neither could he himself nor the Senate, without hearing the cause, distinguish between justice and violence, that therefore, delivering up Cotys, he should come, and upon him effectually transfer the odium of the crime. This letter Latinius Pandus, pro-praetor of Maesia, transmitted to Thrace by the soldiers sent to receive Cotys. Rescuporis, wavering long between fear and rage, determined at last rather to be guilty of a finished than an imperfect villainy. He caused Cotys to be murdered, and belied his death, as if by his own hands it had been procured. Neither yet did Tiberius change his favourite course of dissembling, but upon the death of Pandus, whom Rescuperus alleged to have been his enemy, preferred to the government of Maesia Pomponius Flaccus, an ancient officer, one in close friendship with the king, and by it more qualified to betray him. Hence chiefly he was preferred. Flaccus passed into Thrace, and, though he found him full of hesitation and revolving with great dismay upon the crying horror of his own wickedness, yet by mighty promises prevailed upon him to enter the Roman barrier. Here the king, on pretence of solemnity and honour, was surrounded with a strong party and a crowd of officers, who pressed him by earnest exhortations and many arguments, and the further they travelled, the more apparent to him was his confinement, so that at last, convinced of the necessity of going, he was by them haled to Rome. He was accused before the Senate by the wife of Cotys, and condemned to exile far from his kingdom. Thrace was divided between Rhematalces his son, who, it was manifest, had opposed all his father's outrageous measures, and the sons of Cotys. These were minors, and placed with their kingdom under the administration of Trebellianus Rufus, formerly praetor, after the example of our ancestors, who sent Marcus Lepidus into Egypt in quality of guardian to the children of Ptolemy. Rescuperus was transported to Alexandria, and there slain, attempting flight, or falsely charged with it. At the same time Vonones, who had been removed, as I have above related, into Cilicia, corrupted his keepers and endeavoured to escape to Armenia, thence to the Albanians and Heniochians, and then to his kinsman the king of Scythia. Thus, pretending to hunt, and avoiding the maritime coasts, he gained the devious recesses of the forests, and then, on a sudden, rode full speed to the river Pyramus. But the countrymen, apprised of the king's flight, had broken the bridges, neither was the stream to be forded. Upon the banks, therefore, of the river he was by Vibius Fronto, general of horse, put in bonds, and presently after, by Remius, a resumed veteran, lately his keeper, run through, in affected wrath, with a sword. Hence arose the stronger belief that, from consciousness of fraud and dread of discovery, Vonones was slain. Germanicus, returning from Egypt, learned that all his orders left with the legions and the eastern cities were either entirely abolished or contrary regulations established, a ground for his severe resentment and reproaches upon Piso. Nor less keen were the efforts and machinations of Piso against Germanicus. Yet Piso afterwards determined to leave Syria, but was detained by the following illness of Germanicus. Again, when he heard of his recovery, and perceived that vows were paid for his restoration, the lictors by his command broke the solemnity, drove away the victims already at the altars, overturned the apparatus of the sacrifice, and scattered the people of Antioch employed in celebrating the festival. He then departed to Seleucia, waiting the event of the malady which had again assaulted Germanicus. His own persuasion, too, that poison was given him by Piso, heightened the cruel vehemence of the disease. Indeed, upon the floors and walls were found fragments of human bodies, the spoils of the grave, with charms and incantations, and the name of Germanicus graved on sheets of lead, carcasses half burnt, besmeared with gore, and other witchcrafts, by which souls are thought doomed to the infernal gods. Besides, there were certain persons, charged as creatures of Piso, purposely sent and employed to watch the progress and efforts of the disease. These things filled Germanicus with apprehensions great as his resentment. If his doors, he said, were besieged, if under the eyes of his enemies he must render up his spirit, what was to be expected to his unhappy wife, what to his infant children? The progress of poison was thought too slow, Piso was impatient, and urging with eagerness to command alone the legions, to possess alone the province. But Germanicus was not sunk to such lowness and impotence that the price of his murder should remain with the murderer. And by a letter to Piso he renounced his friendship. Some add that he commanded him to depart the province, nor did Piso tarry longer, but took ship, yet checked her sailing, in order to return with the more quickness should the death of Germanicus the while leave the government of Syria vacant. Germanicus, after a small revival drooping again, when his end approached, spoke on this wise to his attending friends: "Were I to yield to the destiny of nature, just even then were my complaints against the gods for hurrying me from my parents, my children, and my country by a hasty death in the prime of life. Now, shortened in my course by the malignity of Piso and his wife, to your breasts I commit my last prayers. Tell my father, tell my brother, with what violent persecutions afflicted, with what mortal snares circumvented, I end a most miserable life by death of all others the worst. All they whose hopes in my fortune, all they whose kindred blood, and even they whose envy possess them with impressions about me whilst living, shall bewail me dead, that once great in glory, and surviving so many wars, I fell at last by the dark devices of a woman. To you place will be left to complain in the Senate, place to invoke the aid and vengeance of the laws. To commemorate the dead with slothful wailings is not the principal office of friends. They are to remember his dying wishes, to fulfill his last desires. Even strangers will lament Germanicus. You are my friends. If you loved me rather than my fortune, you will vindicate your friendship. Show the people of Rome my wife, her who is the granddaughter of Augustus, and enumerate to them our offspring, even 6 children. Their compassion will surely attend you who accuse, and the accused, if they pretend clandestine warrants of iniquity, will not be believed, if believed, not pardoned." His friends, as a pledge of their fidelity, touching the hand of the dying prince, swore that they would forego their lives sooner than their revenge. Then, turning to his wife, he besought her that in tenderness to his memory, in tenderness to their common children, she would banish her haughty spirit, yield to her hostile fortune, nor upon her return to Rome, by an impotent competition for ruling, irritate those who were masters of rule. So much openly, and more in secret, whence he was believed to have warned her of guile and danger from Tiberius. Soon after he expired, to the heavy sorrow of the province and of all the neighbouring countries, insomuch that remote nations and foreign kings were mourners. Such had been his complacency to our confederates, such his humanity to his enemies. Alike venerable he was, whether you saw him or heard him, and without ever departing from the grave port and dignity of his sublime rank, he yet lived destitute of arrogance and untouched by envy. The funeral, which was performed without exterior pomp or a procession of images, drew its solemnity from the loud praises and amiable memory of his virtues. There were those who, from the loveliness of his person, his age, his manner of dying, and even from the proximity of places where both departed, compared him in the circumstances of his fate to the great Alexander. Each of a graceful person, each of illustrious descent, in years neither much exceeding 30, both victims to the malice and machinations of their own people in the midst of foreign nations. But Germanicus, gentle towards his friends, his pleasures moderate, confined to one wife, all his children by one bed, nor less a warrior, though not so rash, however hindered from a final reduction of Germany, broken by him in so many victories and ready for the yoke. So that, had he been sole arbiter of things, had he acted with the sovereignty and title of royalty, he had easier overtaken him in the glory of conquests, as he surpassed him in clemency, in moderation, and in other virtues. His body, before its commitment to the pile, was exhibited naked in the Forum of Antioch, the place where the pile was erected. Whether it bore the marks of poison remained undecided, for people, as they were divided in their affections, as they pitied Germanicus and presumed the guilt of Piso, or were partial to him, gave opposite accounts. It was next debated amongst the legates of the legions and the other senators there, to whom should be committed the administration of Syria, and after the faint efforts of others it was long disputed between Vibius Marsus and Cneius Sentius. Marsus at last yielded to Sentius, the older man and the more vehement competitor. By him one Martina, infamous in that province for practices in poisoning and a close confidant of Plancina, was sent to Rome at the suit of Vitellius, Varanius, and others, who were preparing criminal articles against Piso and Plancina as against persons evidently guilty. Agrippina, though overwhelmed with sorrow, and her body indisposed, yet impatient of all delays to her revenge, embarked with the ashes of Germanicus and her children, attended with universal commiseration. That a lady in quality a princess, wont to be beheld in her late splendid wedlock with applauses and adorations, was now seen bearing in her bosom her husband's funeral urn, uncertain of vengeance for him and fearful for herself, unfortunate in her fruitfulness, and from so many children obnoxious to so many blows of fortune. Piso the while was overtaken at the Isle of Coos by a message that Germanicus was deceased, and received it intemperately, slew victims, and repaired with thanksgivings to the temples. Yet however immoderate and undisguised was his joy, more arrogant and insulting proved that of Plancina, who immediately threw off her mourning, which for the death of a sister she wore, and assumed a dress adapted to gaiety and gladness. About him flocked the centurions with officious representations, that upon him particularly were bent the affections and zeal of the legions, and he should proceed to resume the province, at first injuriously taken from him, and now destitute of a governor. As he therefore consulted what he had best pursue, his son Marcus Piso advised a speedy journey to Rome. Hitherto, he said, nothing past expiation was committed, neither were impotent suspicions to be dreaded, nor the idle blazonings of fame. His variance and contention with Germanicus was, perhaps, subject to popular hate and aversion, but to no prosecution or penalty, and by bereaving him of the province his enemies were gratified. But if he returned thither, as Sentius would certainly oppose him with arms, a civil war would thence be actually begun. Neither would the centurions and soldiers persist in his party, men with whom the recent memory of their late commander and an inveterate love to the Caesars in general were still prevalent. Domitius Celer, one in intimate credit with Piso, argued on the contrary, that the present event must by all means be improved. It was Piso and not Sentius who had commission to govern Syria. Upon him were conferred the jurisdiction of praetor and the badges of magistracy, and with him the legions were entrusted. so that if acts of hostility were by his opponents attempted, with how much better warrant could he avow assuming arms in his own right and defence, who was thus vested with the authority of general, and acted under special orders from the emperor? Rumours, too, were to be neglected and left to perish with time. In truth, to the sallies and violence of recent hate the innocent were often unequal. But were he once possessed of the army, and had well augmented his forces, many things not to be foreseen would from fortune derive success. Are we then preposterously hastening to arrive at Rome with the ashes of Germanicus, that you may there fall, unheard and undefended, a victim to the wailings of Agrippina, a prey to the passionate populace governed by the first impressions of rumour? Livia, it is true, is your confederate, Tiberius is your friend, but both secretly, and indeed none will more pompously bewail the violent fate of Germanicus than such as do most sincerely rejoice for it. Piso, of himself prompt to violent pursuits, was with no great labour persuaded into this opinion, and, in a letter transmitted to Tiberius, accused Germanicus of luxury and pride, that for himself he had been expulsed to leave room for dangerous designs against the state, and now resumed with his former faith and loyalty the care of the army. In the meantime he put Domitius on board a galley, and ordered him to avoid appearing upon the coasts or amongst the isles, but through the main sea to sail to Syria. The deserters, who from all quarters were flocking to him in crowds, he formed into companies, and armed all the retainers to the camp. Then, sailing over to the continent, intercepted a regiment of recruits upon their march into Syria, and wrote to the small kings of Cilicia to assist him with present succours. Nor was the younger Piso slow in prosecuting all the measures of war, though to adventure a war had been against his sentiments and advice. As they coasted Lycia and Pamphylia, they encountered the ships which carried Agrippina, with hostile spirits on each side, and each at first prepared for combat. But as equal dread of one another possessed both, they proceeded not further than mutual contumelies. Vibius Marsus particularly summoned Piso as a criminal to Rome, there to make his defence. He answered with derision that when the praetor who was to sit upon poisonings had assigned a day to the accusers and the accused, he would attend. Domitius, the while, landing at Laodicea, a city of Syria, would have proceeded to the winter quarters of the 6th Legion, which he believed to be the most prone to engage in novel attempts, but was prevented by Pacuvius, its commander. Sentius represented this by letter to Piso, and warned him at his peril to infect the camp by ministers of corruption, or to assail the province by war, and drew into a body such as he knew loved Germanicus, or such as were averse to his foes. Upon them he inculcated with much ardour that Piso was with open arms attacking the majesty of the prince, and invading the Roman state, and then marched at the head of a puissant body, equipped for battle, and resolute to engage. Neither failed Piso, though his enterprises had thus far miscarried, to apply the securest remedies to his present perplexities, and therefore seized a castle of Cilicia strongly fortified, its name Serendris. For to the auxiliary Cilicians sent him by the petty kings he had joined his body of deserters, as also the recruits lately intercepted, with all his own and Plancina's slaves, and thus in number and bulk had of the whole composed a legion. To them he thus harangued: I, who am the lieutenant of Caesar, am yet violently excluded from the province which to me Caesar has committed. Not excluded by the legions, for by their invitation I am arrived, but by Sentius, who thus disguises under feigned crimes against me his own animosity and personal hate. But with confidence you may stand in battle, where the opposite army upon the site of Piso, a commander lately by themselves styled their father, will certainly refuse to fight. They know, too, that were right to decide it, I am the stronger, and of no mean puissance in a trial at arms." He then arrayed his men without the fortifications, on a hill steep and craggy, for all the rest was begirt by the sea. Against them stood the veterans, regularly embattled, and supported with a body of reserve, so that here appeared the force of men, there only the terror and stubbornness of situation. On Piso's side was no spirit, no hope, nor even weapons, save those of rustics, for instant necessity hastily acquired. As soon as they came to blows, the issue was no longer doubtful than while the Roman cohorts struggled up the steep. The Cilicians then fled, and shut themselves up in the castle. Piso, having the while attempted in vain to storm the fleet, which rode at a small distance, as soon as he returned, presented himself upon the walls, where, by a succession of passionate complaints and entreaties, now bemoaning in agonies the bitterness of his lot, then calling and cajoling every particular soldier by his name, and by rewards tempting all, he laboured to excite a sedition, and thus much he had already effected, that the eagle-bearer of the 6th Legion revolted to him with his eagle. This alarmed Sentius, and instantly he commanded the cornets and trumpets to sound, a mount to be raised, the ladders placed, and the bravest men to mount, and others to pour from the engines volleys of darts and stones and flaming torches. The obstinacy of Piso was at last vanquished, and he desired that upon delivering his arms he might remain in the castle till the emperor's pleasure, to whom he would commit the government of Syria, were known, conditions which were not accepted, nor was aught granted him save ships and a passport to Rome. After the illness of Germanicus became noised abroad there, and all its circumstances, like rumours magnified by distance, were related with many aggravations, sadness seized the people. They burned with indignation, and even poured out in plaints the anguish of their souls. For this, they said, he had been banished to the extremities of the empire. For this the province of Syria was committed to Piso, and these the fruits of Livia's mysterious conferences with Plancina. Truly had our fathers spoken concerning his father Drusus, that the possessors of rule beheld with an evil eye the popular spirit of their sons, nor for aught else were they sacrificed, but for their equal treatment of the Roman people, and studying to restore the popular state. These lamentations of the populace were, upon the tidings of his death, so inflamed, that without staying for an edict from the magistrates, without a decree of senate, they by general consent assumed a vacation. The public courts were deserted, private houses shut up. Prevalent everywhere were the symptoms of woe, heavy groans, dismal silence. The whole a scene of real sorrow, and nothing devised for form or show. And though they forbore not to bear the exterior marks and habiliments of mourning, in their souls they mourned still deeper. Accidentally some merchants from Syria, who had left Germanicus still alive, brought more joyful news of his condition. These were instantly believed and instantly proclaimed. Each, as fast as they met, informed others, who forthwith conveyed their light information with improvements and accumulated joy to more. All flew with exultation through the city, and, to pay their thanks and vows, burst open the temple doors. The night, too, heightened their credulity, and affirmation was bolder in the dark. Nor did Tiberius restrain the course of these fictions, but left them to vanish with time. Hence with more bitterness they afterwards grieved for him, as if anew snatched from them. Honours were invented and decreed to Germanicus, various as the affections and genius of the particular senators who proposed them. That his name should be sung in the Salian hymns, curule chairs placed for him amongst the priests of Augustus, and over these chairs oaken crowns hung. His statue in ivory precede in the Circensian games. None but one of the Julian race be in the room of Germanicus created flamen or augur. Triumphal arches were added, one at Rome, one upon the banks of the Rhine, one upon Mount Amanus in Syria, with inscriptions of his exploits, and a testimony subjoined that he died for the commonwealth. A sepulchre at Antioch, where his corpse was burnt. A tribunal at Epidaphne, the place where he ended his life. The multitude of statues, the many places where divine honours were appointed to be paid him, would not be easily recounted. They would have also decreed him, as to one of the masters of eloquence, a golden shield, signal in bulk as in metal. But Tiberius offered to dedicate one himself, such as was usual, and of a like size with others, for that eloquence was not measured by fortune, and it was sufficient glory if he were ranked with ancient writers. The battalion called after the name of the Junii was now, by the equestrian order, entitled the Battalion of Germanicus, and a rule made that on every 15th of July these troops should follow, as their standard, the effigies of Germanicus. Of these honours many continue. Some were instantly omitted, or by time are utterly obliterated. In the height of this public sorrow, Livia, sister to Germanicus and married to Drusus, was delivered of male twins, an event even in middling families rare and acceptable, and to Tiberius such mighty matter of joy that he could not refrain boasting to the fathers that to no Roman of the same eminence before him were ever two children born at a birth. For to his own glory he turned all things, even things fortuitous. But to the people, at such a sad conjuncture, it brought fresh anguish, as they feared that the family of Drusus, thus increased, would press heavily upon that of Germanicus. The same year the lubricity of women was by the Senate restrained with severe laws, and it was provided that no woman should become venal if her father, grandfather, or husband were Roman knights. For Vistilia, a lady born of a Praetorian family, had, before the aediles, published herself a prostitute, upon a custom allowed by our ancestors, who thought that prostitutes were, by thus avowing their infamy, sufficiently punished. Titirius Labeo, too, was questioned, that in the manifest guilt of his wife he had neglected the punishment prescribed by the law, but he alleged that the 60 days allowed for consultation were not elapsed, and it was deemed sufficient to proceed against Vistilia, who was banished to the Isle of Seriphos. Measures were also taken for exterminating the solemnities of the Jews and Egyptians, and by decree of Senate 4,000 descendants of franchised slaves, all tainted with that superstition, but of proper strength and age, were to be transported to Sardinia to restrain the Sardinian robbers. And if, through the malignity of the climate, they perished, despicable would be the loss. The rest were doomed to depart Italy, unless by a stated day they renounced their profane rites. After this, Tiberius represented that to supply the place of Oxia, who had presided 57 years with the highest sanctimony over the Vestals, another virgin was to be chosen, and thanked Fonteius Agrippa and Asinius Pollio that, by offering their daughters, they contended in good offices towards the commonwealth. Pollio's daughter was preferred, for nothing else but that her mother had ever continued in the same wedlock, for Agrippa by a divorce had impaired the credit of his house. Upon her who was postponed, Tiberius in consolation bestowed for her fortune 1,000 great sesterces. As the people murmured at the severe dearth of corn, he settled grain at a price certain to the buyer, and undertook to pay 14 pence a measure to the seller. Neither yet would he accept the name of father of his country, a title offered him before, and for these bounties now again. Nay, he sharply rebuked such as styled these provisions of his divine occupations, and him lord. Hence freedom of speech became cramped and insecure under such a prince, one who dreaded liberty and abhorred flattery. I find in the writers of those times, some of them senators, that in the Senate were read letters from Adgandestrius, prince of the Catians, undertaking to dispatch Arminius if in order to it poison were sent him, and an answer returned that not by frauds and blows in the dark, but armed and in the face of the sun, the Roman people took vengeance on their foes. In this Tiberius gained equal glory with our ancient captains, who rejected and disclosed a plot to poison King Pyrrhus. Arminius, however, who, upon the departure of the Romans and expulsion of Maroboduus, aimed at royalty, became thence engaged in a struggle against the liberty of his country, and in defence of their liberty his countrymen took arms against him, so that while with various fortune he contended with them, he fell by the treachery of his own kindred. The deliverer of Germany without doubt he was, one who assailed the Roman power not like other kings and leaders in its first elements, but in its highest pride and elevation, one sometimes beaten in battle, but never conquered in war. 37 years he lived, 12 he commanded, and amongst these barbarous nations his memory is still celebrated in their songs, though his name be unknown in the annals of the Greeks, who only admire their own national exploits and renown, nor even amongst the Romans does this great captain bear much distinction, while overlooking instances of modern prowess and glory, we only delight to magnify men and feats of old. End of section 24.